Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for what I know is going to be a really interesting and important discussion. We have two very, very special and very learned guests with us today who will also speak and help take your questions on this very important topic. We have, first of all, Whitney Phillips, who is, there you go, a professor at Syracuse University and one of our nation's leading experts on online disinformation and how to counter it. She's the author of a book with a really fun title, This is Why We Can't Have Nice Things, Mapping the Relationship Between Online Trolling and Mainstream Culture. And I think you see us kind of all together up at the top, we have Oren Siegel, who is the Vice President of the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League. The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is one of the leading organizations in our country mapping and tracking the activities of extremist groups online and in our communities, working very, very closely with our nation's law enforcement agencies to try to identify folks who might be on the verge of committing violence and other crimes. And I can tell you from my conversations with the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, their partnership with the ADL is extremely important and extremely strong. And so we're very, very grateful to have Oren here as well to speak about that aspect of the problem. So look, this is a forum where we're going to talk about the phenomenon of online disinformation, conspiracy theories, and QAnon in particular, because that is the main manifestation of this problem right now in the United States. It is a national problem. It is also local. We've had a couple of incidents recently just in our congressional district that remind us that that folks who are susceptible to these theories, and perhaps in one case someone who's a leading propagator online of the QAnon conspiracy live in our district. And I know that has sparked additional interest in this forum, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about it. But this is a national phenomenon. It's not unique to any of our communities. There are aspects of it that seem new and that are new, but I want to start by stressing that what we're seeing is actually something very, very old. The central theory, conspiracy theory that QAnon promotes is basically the ancient anti-Semitic blood libel. The idea that there is a secret, powerful cabal of people, many of whom happen to be Jewish, who are manipulating events behind our backs and taking our children, drinking their blood, conducting strange rituals. It seems crazy, and yet this has been around for hundreds of years. And QAnon has given it a kind of new and modern guise. And I guess there's something seductive to the human personality about that kind of idea that, that there is this hidden truth, there's this secret that has been kept from us by powerful people. But, if you take this red pill or this blue pill, you will know that truth and you will join this organization of brave people who are going to stand up for that truth. Think about that. It's the theme of a lot of movies that we're all entertained by, that, a single individual is made aware of some deep, dark, shadowy conspiracy, and that individual, maybe working with 3 or 4 other people, rises to the occasion and defeats it. And that's that fantasy that these kinds of conspiracy theories play to. But there are some aspects of it that are quite, I think, unique and special. First of all, QAnon may have begun with this Pizzagate theory about powerful people being behind sex trafficking, but it has become a movement that encompasses all conspiracy theories. It's sort of like a do-it-yourself conspiracy theory kit. It encourages its followers, who now number apparently in the millions. I'd love to hear our experts' view about that, to basically do their own research, as they say, and come up with conspiratorial answers to everything that is troubling them. So it encompasses, the crazy idea that 9/11 was an inside job, alien landings, the Kennedy assassination, anti-vaxxers right now. The coronavirus is a hoax, is part of this whole conspiratorial way of thinking, and that makes it particularly dangerous. Because what it is doing in the larger sense is it's vaccinating millions of people against truth. It's immunizing them against facts. It's giving them permission to disbelieve experts, to disbelieve the government, to disbelieve scientists, to disbelieve doctors. Very dangerous, in particular, at a moment when we're facing this global pandemic. And while QAnon, at least from what I've seen, it doesn't specifically promote violence. When people who are already, whose minds are already a little bit disturbed, hear about things like, children being abused, it absolutely does increase the likelihood that some of the people who become obsessed with these conspiracy theories will take matters into their own hands and commit acts of violence. The FBI has labeled QAnon and fringe conspiracy theories like it as a major driver of domestic extremism in our country and potentially violent attacks against individuals and institutions. And there have already been violent attacks inspired by QAnon. And then finally, what's really new and different is this is happening not in the 19th century in Russia, like the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's happening today in a world where we are all connected by the internet, where social media algorithms that decide what we see on the internet are designed to push to everybody online the most extreme versions of what we already believe, right? Facebook and YouTube, all these sites, they know what we are searching for. They know what we're interested in, and they keep pushing us more extreme versions of those things because they want to keep us glued to the screen. So we'll see a lot of ads and buy a lot of stuff. So that's a big part of what we're going to discuss today. As many of you know, I've taken some actions. I have introduced and am leading a bipartisan resolution in the House of Representatives condemning QAnon and the conspiracy theories that it promotes. The important thing about this is that we have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats who are sponsoring this resolution. My goal, if we can pass this, is to demonstrate that there is broad bipartisan rejection of this movement in the United States. So whatever the president may be tweeting or retweeting, most Republicans and Democrats stand together against this. And finally, the second thing we are looking at doing, this is very complicated but very important, is finding an appropriate way to regulate the ways in which our social media companies put out information, to ensure that they do it in a more responsible way, and that those of us who use these sites have more options to opt in or opt out from this kind of algorithmic promotion that is spreading extremism and hate online. So those are some of the things I'm doing. I'd love now to turn it over to our two experts to continue the conversation, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. And I think we're going to begin with you, Whitney, and then have Oren close out.
Yeah, so thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. So before I dive into the specifics of QAnon, I want to focus on not just what it is, but what it's done. And this is going to echo a little bit of what the congressman just explained. QAnon has spread virulent anti-Semitism and other extremist messaging and has been linked to specific instances of real-world violence. It's also been central to the spread of enormous amounts of COVID mis and disinformation, and even outright COVID denialism, putting the health of countless millions of citizens at risk. And it's also laying the groundwork for a contested election, perhaps even violence in the streets if Trump loses in November. And of course, speaking of elections, QAnon is only an election away from being woven into the fabric of government. A number of QAnon believers, or at least people who are QAnon adjacent, are on the ballot in 2020. So all that said, the specific QAnon narrative claims that Donald Trump is fighting and winning a war against an evil, satanic pedophile ring comprised of top Democrats who are secretly running a shadow government hell-bent on destroying the Trump presidency from within. And this shadow government is known as the deep state, a false narrative that emerged in response to the Mueller investigation when that kicked off in 2017. And once the deep state theory was embraced by pro-Trump media, it began absorbing other far-right conspiracy theories that had been circulating throughout the 2016 election, most notably Pizzagate, which stated that Hillary Clinton was running a satanic child sex ring out of the back of a Washington, D.C. pizza shop. She was not. And with all the energy it had already gathered, the deep state theory then fused with, it kind of gave birth to, it kind of was boosted by QAnon, which also emerged in 2017, a few months after the deep state narrative first started circulating pretty prominently. And as the connections to satanic ritual abuse attest, QAnon is an extreme theory, and so are its claims about the deep state. But the underlying ideas animating QAnon and the deep state are increasingly common within far-right circles, not all conservative circles, but certain far-right circles. And that's the idea that there's an underhanded group of lying anti-Trump, Obama holdover liberals doing everything they can to sabotage the country for their own political gain. And one of the most common and most dangerous facets of this kind of theorizing is that Democrats in the government and public health experts believed to be in cahoots with the Democrats are over-exaggerating or outright lying about the COVID-19 threat in order to tank the economy and ensure Trump's defeat in November. And QAnon has recently spun off an even more subtle iteration than that, which is the Save the Children movement, which purports to be opposed to child sex trafficking, but is either organized by QAnon believers in the effort to launder the conspiracy theory into more mainstream circles, or isn't knowingly tied to QAnon, but still draws narrative threads and other information from the QAnon mythology. And as a quick preemption here, many people argue, and understandably so, that saving the children is a very good cause. So why should anyone be concerned, even if the rallies are connected to QAnon? And my answer to that is the list that I opened with. QAnon has done real demonstrable harm. The COVID denialism and falsehood that QAnon has pushed across social media is quite literally a life and death issue. Anything that encourages people to look at QAnon sympathetically or otherwise exposes people to the theory through these more sort of innocuous seeming means risks opening these same people up to the belief in the more explicitly harmful elements of the theory and to the social media rabbit holes that I will discuss in just a moment. So in other words, saving the children in itself is a noble cause, of course, but that noble cause has, sometimes deliberately and sometimes accidentally, been poisoned and weaponized. And so I'll conclude this overview by emphasizing that QAnon cannot and should not be separated out from the wider political and media landscape. Understanding why people are drawn to the theory and what keeps them sucked in is the first step in figuring out how best to respond both at the interpersonal level and then at the policy level as well. So first, people aren't suddenly transformed into QAnon believers. Just talking to a QAnon believer isn't going to infect you. QAnon and the deep state draw people in because these theories line up with a person's existing political beliefs. basically QAnon and the deep state feel familiar, feel true to a lot of folks, making both theories easy to embrace, especially if someone is easing in with the more subtle articulations of the theory. And this is also what makes debunking the theory so difficult. They form the core of many people's identities. And you can't just throw facts at a person's basic sense of self and expect that to be enough. That's a deeply complicating element to all of this. And so relatedly, many people have been drawn in by QAnon and the deep state because, ironically, it's been denied so forcibly by so many news organizations. Now, for people, some of you may be in the audience now, who generally trust the news media, those denials clear the issue right up, no problem. But on the other hand, for people who generally think that the news media is fake news and that all they do is lie, those denials end up serving as evidence for QAnon believers or a point of intrigue for the QAnon curious. And that's not the only institutional force drawing people to QAnon and the deep state. Mistrust in other kinds of institutions also play a role, namely science and government, of course, and higher education, and anything that claims specialized expertise. People on the far right, again, which is not equated with Republicans or conservatism generally, but on the far right, are especially primed not to trust institutions, particularly when those institutions are regarded as liberal institutions, which helps explain why there are so many Trump-supporting QAnon believers. But people who otherwise wouldn't be in the MAGA orbit, but who are, for example, anti-vaxxers because they don't trust the medical establishment, or who think corporations secretly control things, they're also primed in different ways to believe at least the basic QAnon deep state assertions. And finally, people are drawn into the QAnon and deep state web and are kept there because recommendation algorithms on social media platforms keep feeding them evidence, or what looks like evidence, to people who mistrust the official explanation and then feel compelled to do their own independent research. The algorithms themselves are not causing the beliefs. People meet algorithms halfway by indicating to the algorithms what they want to see, what they're interested in, what they believe. And the reason that algorithms keep serving this content up is very simply profits. Companies make more money when people click on more things. So they feed us what we're most likely to keep clicking on. And the consequences for conspiracies like QAnon is that people who do their own research, they feel that their beliefs have been confirmed because everything they see online is confirming it. And not just confirming it, but feeding them even more information about even more conspiracies, creating basically a perpetual motion machine of self-reinforcing conspiracy theories. And people think, not unreasonably, that they're seeing this information because they've discovered some deeper truth. But that's not it at all. They're seeing that information because social platforms are directing their site to the things most likely to keep them on site. And that is a recipe for radicalization. So this is a structural problem as much as it is a problem about QAnon itself. So I will wrap it up there, and we'll be happy to speak to any of these issues during the Q&A, and really appreciate your attention and your presence here today.
Thank you so much, Whitney. Oren, take it away.
Thank you, Congressman. I really do appreciate the invitation to be part of this important forum. You know, I also want to just say straight up at the beginning, thank you for your leadership in getting the prevention grants restored. You know, these grants basically allocate funds to entities that are focused on responding and mitigating extremist threats. So we need to double down on keeping communities safe and not just talking about these threats. So thank you again for that.
Thank you.
And thank you all for making the time, to attend this call. You know, these are not light topics, and it's a Friday before a holiday. So, making the time for this, though, is important. So we appreciate it. You know, this topic of conspiracy theories more broadly is actually at the core of much of what we're doing at ADL. You know, and what I hope to describe here is not just what we're doing, but why we have to care about QAnon, especially today. As Vice President of our Center on Extremism, I oversee a team of investigators and analysts who are basically spending their time every day in these online spaces in which conspiracies are created, in which they're disseminated, in which they're able to become normalized and mainstream. These are a wide range of online platforms. And in fact, I believe as we're talking today about mainstreaming hate, it's not just from the mouths of our public officials. It's not just on cable news. It's on our phones. It's on the computers that we're on where most of this mainstreaming occurs. So we track these range of extremist movements. And one of the elements that is central to the foundation of most of these groups, most of these movements that we look at are the conspiracy theories. It's the foundation. As a congressman said, the foundation of age-old hatreds like anti-Semitism, but they continue to be the lifeblood of much of the hate and extremism and misinformation and disinformation that we see today. Conspiracy theories have an unusual power to motivate people to action. Some who are associated with far-right ideologies, others with far-left ideologies, believe in these conspiracy theories. Many, transcend ideology altogether. Like, think about conspiracies around the 9/11 attacks or the assassination of JFK. Conspiracies are not the sole domain of any one extremist movement. And under the right circumstances, they can lead to violence, especially when they single out specific people, specific organizations, portray them as villains, even the most far-fetched conspiracy theories. And when we're talking about QAnon, there's a lot of far-fetched elements to that. Those can trigger extreme reactions by those who are the most truest of believers. Now, you heard from Whitney about, what QAnon is. And so why are we concerned? This first surfaced in 2017 on the fringes of a platform called 4chan. We have seen, though, how the internet, especially through memes and humor and irony, has served to normalize hate and extremism. These spaces that sometimes you only hear about, 4chan and 8kun, and they actually provide people with information in which extremist ideologies exist in the same space as legitimate news. It's hard for people to make the distinction between those two things. QAnon is also an active theory that sows distrust in democratic institutions. This is a key as to why we all have a stake in caring about it. Such distrust is bad for communities. When conspiracy grows, anti-Semitism and bigotry and all forms of hate are not far behind. And when we're talking about undermining our democratic institutions, there's an extra level of concern, especially as we are in an election year. So, I want to be clear. ADL does not believe that all QAnon adherents are inherently extremist. But that doesn't mean that this is not a dangerous theory. And we have seen how it has inspired dangerous acts. And the congressman mentioned even the FBI has gone out and stated how conspiracy-driven domestic extremism is a growing threat. So we must remember how fragile we can be to some of these narratives. Most extremist movements develop or depend upon conspiracy theories. In the U.S., we have seen conspiracies about Sharia law taking over all of our legal remedies across the country. We've seen anti-immigrant vigilantes talk about drug cartels who want to wage a secret war against and invade the United States. Conspiracies lie at the heart of so many of these extremist worldviews. Modern white supremacy, for example, centers on the belief that the white race is in danger of extinction from a growing number of non-whites who are controlled and manipulated by a nefarious Jewish conspiracy. Right? We need to take that seriously because we've seen the impacts that such conspiracies can have. When you look at the posts or reposts attributed to the man who killed 11 people at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, it showed that he believed in this common white supremacist conspiracy that I mentioned, that Jews are engineering mass immigration to Europe and the United States to pollute and eventually destroy the white race. Conspiracy theories are particularly able to motivate people to action if they point to specific places, to specific people, or institutions as being those who are responsible. This practice gives extremists, even non-extremists who strongly believe in such theories, places to explore, to victimize, and target. We saw this with a precursor to QAnon called the Pizzagate, where an armed individual actually went to a pizza place in Washington, D.C., because he believed they were people who were holding young children, pedophiles, to try to sell them. And they were, organized by the Democratic Party. I mean, this is the stuff of fantasy and yet has motivated people to act. And I'm going to conclude with this. In 2020, as we are still dealing with the pandemic, it has become pure fodder for these conspiracy theorists, including QAnon. Fear and anxiety and uncertainty create opportunities for conspiracies to thrive, for extremists to thrive. And extremists never miss an opportunity to leverage a crisis. And as the demonstrations that we see spread to communities around the country, so too does the disinformation about those protests and those protesters. In a time of social unrest and racial tension, these false claims sow further fear and division, undermining efforts to build coalitions and bring about lasting change. As we enter the final stage in this election season, being able to recognize not only the impact of conspiracy theories, but I gotta tell you, being able to recognize conspiracy theories at all needs to be a top priority. Conspiracies that seek to delegitimize our democratic institutions are particularly dangerous. Now, I know I should be a motivational speaker. We all feel better now about everything, right? But here, I promise you there is hope. We can't do this type of work without having hope. And so there are things that we all can do, and maybe we can explore that in the Q&A to make sure that modern conspiracies are not normalized. Everybody on this call, all of you whose faces I see and those who are not showing your faces, you have a role as in this fight. Don't be part of the algorithms that are trying to take advantage of you. Be mindful of what you share and think about how those are trying to manipulate you to believe the things of fantasy. Together, I think we can do this. So thanks again for the time and look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Oren. Thanks so much. And I'm glad you ended on that note because we want to talk here about what can be done. I'm going to start by asking you guys one of the most common questions that we got from our participants. And I fear it may be one of the hardest questions. So I apologize for starting with a really hard one. But a lot of folks asked if you know somebody in your family, somebody who is a friend, begins to get sucked into this way of thinking, this conspiratorial way of thinking, whether it's QAnon or something like it, what can you say to that person? What would you recommend that folks do if it's somebody you care about? Whitney, you want to start?
Sure, yes. That's a great question. And of course, it's a very difficult question. I sort of hinted at some of this in my remarks. There's often this belief that if we are encountered by something that's false, we just say facts at it until it agrees with us. And because these theories are often felt in the body, they're experienced, people really believe that they're true. If you come out and just say you're wrong or worse, you're crazy, that has a tendency to not only not correct the false belief, but it can make that person think you're somehow in on it or you're sympathetic to the deep state. And so for me, I think it's really important when you have these conversations to zoom out and call attention to some of the network dynamics at play. People know that they receive information online, but few people are actually taught how they receive information and what role algorithms play. If you're a person who starts clicking on some videos about QAnon and then you find more stuff about QAnon and then you find even more stuff and it all is telling this very compelling story, it's really easy. It's understandable why someone would feel like they've discovered this hidden truth, as the congressman was saying earlier. But that's based not on the factuality of that information, but not really understanding that you're being served up something by an algorithm because they think you want to see it. And so if you can explain to someone you are seeing this information not because you're discovering a truth, but this is how algorithms work. These are the network dynamics at play. Not only is that not just accusing someone of being crazy or just wrong, it presents an alternative explanation for why they're seeing all the things they're seeing, because that's a compelling argument. If there wasn't something to this, why is it everywhere? So by redirecting that conversation, talking about a different process at play, that could at the very least open up the possibility that what someone sees online, just because you're seeing it doesn't mean you should believe it. Evidence, observation is not confirmation on the internet. So that's a place to start, even though that's not going to get you to the end of the road, but it's the first step down that road.
Yeah. Oren, do you want to add anything? And I'm thinking, we've probably learned some things from dealing with past extremist movements, including terrorist groups, which have a kind of a similar methodology of recruitment and mindset.
Yeah,
leading people away.
I can add just briefly. There are some organizations, Parents for Peace, Life After Hate. These are made up of former extremists in many cases, or families of those who have dealt with that, who can provide a perspective. Sometimes the only way to reach somebody who's going down a path is to be able to identify with them in a real way and say, I've been there. And so those are options. I also want to underscore another option, and I know this is difficult because I think some of us probably are dealing with this, with families and friends who, as discussion is less and less possible, as we're getting more polarized. This is not like 6 degrees of separation from us. I think we all probably know somebody who we are concerned about maybe, buying into this. And this is why critical thinking skills at a young age, refocusing on our kids. They are spending more time online than ever before. The places that my investigators are spending time looking for extremists are where my kids are spending their time, trying to find entertainment. That's all you need to know about the threat. And so if we can teach kids at an early age how people are trying to brainwash you, how they're trying to, sell you, whether, I think the congressman mentioned goods and services, or whether they're trying to sell you the actual hate. There are ways that we can train kids to try to identify that. And so that's something we need to double down on as well. Critical thinking skills, back to the basics.
Thank you, Oren. DeAndre, you want to get to some of the participants' questions?
Yes. One of our first questions, and seeing it come up a little bit in the chat feature as well, is people feel like it may be a violation of their First Amendment rights. So what speech is not protected by the First Amendment? The person specifically asked, is it illegal to yell fire in a crowded theater?
Let me take a first crack at this. Remember, what the First Amendment says is that the government cannot punish you or prevent you from speaking your mind. So if you want to go out there and say there's a deep state cabal that's drinking the blood of babies, you can. But the U.S. government can't throw you in prison for doing that. And the U.S. government also cannot tell Facebook or Google that they have to, under penalty of law, take down statements that are made by their users. That's what the First Amendment does. But the First Amendment doesn't, for example, require a private company like Facebook or Google or Twitter to allow certain forms of speech. The pornography has always been prohibited on these websites. That's just a choice that these private companies make. And so they certainly have the ability under the First Amendment to set their own standards. And we can encourage them. Congress can encourage them to set high standards. And then there's this question of algorithms. You've heard us refer to this again and again. Here, we're making the case that these social media companies are actually actively promoting this kind of extremist speech because they have written the software, these algorithms, in a way that amplifies the types of speech that are more likely to engage our emotions, particularly negative emotions like fear and hatred, because they have figured out that those are the emotions that keep us obsessively glued to our screens the longest. And, I sometimes compare it, in a pre-online world. Let's say you watch a video on YouTube about a terrorist group, let's say Hamas in the Middle East. And the next day, your phone rings and it's a guy from YouTube. And the guy says, hey, couldn't help but notice that you watched a really cool video about terrorists who are killing Jewish people. And here's what we'd love to do for you. We'd love to send you some really wonderful recommendations about some cool people you can meet on the internet who share your interest in committing acts of terrorism against Jewish people. We'll even send you some links to websites where you can further explore that interest. In effect, that's what these algorithms are doing. They're not calling you on the phone, but they know what you're interested in, and they're going to give you more of it. And certainly, that has nothing to do with the First Amendment. We can put I think we can and should put pressure on these companies to not do that anymore. Whitney, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I also really appreciate this question and these concerns. And so I'm a strong supporter of moderation and finding ways to better regulate these companies. And my position is not that those things are incompatible with free speech, but it's actually necessary to a more robust understanding of free speech, not in the constitutional sense, but the way it's used colloquially, the ability or a perceived right to say what you mean without interference. And it's a framing issue because oftentimes when people talk about free speech in this more colloquial sense, what they're referring to is what's known as negative freedoms. So freedom from restriction. You don't want Facebook telling you what you can and can't say. And so those freedoms are about preserving the right of the individual to say whatever it is that they want. The problem with that, you see this in a classroom, you see this in all kinds of places, when the most antagonistic, aggressive, harmful, bigoted person is screaming all of those things all at once, that doesn't actually contribute to more speech, that contributes to less speech. It makes other people either feel afraid or be afraid, feel dehumanized and not participate. And so in protecting these freedoms you actually minimize the most amount of speech possible, which is ideally the idea behind that sort of colloquial sense of the term. So a different way of looking at it, and this is how I look at it, I want to do what is going to guarantee the most possible speech for the most number of people. And that's what's known as a positive freedom for the collective to enjoy their freedoms equally. And so what that basically is arguing for, the collective should be free from being poisoned, from being screamed at, from being harmed in a way that makes them unable to participate. So shifting how we think about freedoms and whose freedoms are we looking to protect and what are we looking to cultivate, I think is a way that I approach that question. And the end result of that is sometimes you got to do a little moderation to make sure that more people are able to participate in a meaningful way in a democratic process.
Excellent. Well, as the moderator, let me ask DeAndre to call up the next question. And did we lose Oren there for?
Oh no.
DeAndre?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. So it looks like we did lose him, but as soon as he rejoins, I'll add him back in.
Okay.
But our next question, kind of tying into that social media platform, how do we balance giving power to social media platforms to control content along with government oversight and legislation to protect personal freedoms of speech?
Right. Well, that's, I was trying to get at that in my last answer. And we're going to be very careful about this. Again, the First Amendment does not allow the U.S. Congress to tell Facebook to take down a particular form of speech, even if it's racist, even if it's outrageous, even if it's promoting terrible lies. But we do have legal doctrines in our country. that allow people to hold other people accountable for certain forms of speech that cause them harm. Crying fire in a crowded theater, for example, or telling a lie that is so malicious that it is considered libel. For example, if a company, let's say a drug manufacturer, puts out a new drug and says that it will cure the common cold, but instead the drug is dangerous and it hurts a lot of people, right? Well, that's false advertising and they can be held accountable for it. So one of the interesting things about our laws governing social media companies right now is that there's something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, passed in the mid-1990s, which says that the social media companies, the platforms, are not legally liable for anything that we post on their platforms. So if I libel you on Facebook, you can sue me, but you can't sue Facebook. And that was understandable, I think, at the dawn of the internet, when these companies were more like community bulletin boards. They set up the bulletin board and everybody else can go and post what they want. So, don't hold the bulletin board company accountable for that. What has changed, as we keep coming back to, is that the companies are now writing these algorithms, these programs that are deciding which pieces of information on that bulletin board you and I will see. They are promoting certain kinds of content based on the data that they have about us. And so one of the questions that we need to wrestle with is, should they face more legal responsibility for content that maybe somebody else posts, but which they are promoting so that it reaches millions and millions of people? You want to go to the next one, DeAndre?
Yes. We will actually switch gears. We're trying to still get Oren back in, but we'll switch gears to some of our live questions.
Okay.
Just to go over. You back in? Just to go over our live questions, how we'll be doing our live questions. Please pay attention to the chat feature. I will be messaging you there to let you know when you're next about your question. When your question does come up, please just unmute yourself. I'll call on you here. Please just unmute yourself and go ahead with your question to our panelists. Again, after that question, we will go ahead and mute you back just to get to as many people, as many questions as possible. So please don't feel offended or anything like that. If you do have any follow-up, please just send another message and we'll try to get to your question or your follow-up again on the call later. Other than that, that's all I have in regards to that. If you're having any troubles, please just send me a message in the chat feature and I will try to address it before we get there. And please just remember to submit your name and the town you're from when you submit your question. Our first question comes from Caroline from Lambertville. Caroline, can you hear us?
I can. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody, all of our speakers, Tom and our two other speakers, experts on this very important issue. The first thought that crossed my mind, while obviously social media is central to the perpetuation of conspiracy theories, in the past few days, I've been seeing on Twitter and other media this notion that the president wants to introduce, quote, patriotic education into the public school system, which sort of put me on high alert. And I wonder whether I'm correct in kind of reading that as maybe code for, among other things, the opportunity for QAnon conspiracy theories to find their way into public education. And looking ahead, should our government not switch gears as a result of the elections, I guess. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
This is theory.
What could happen and what can we do? And am I being paranoid?
No one, the last thing we want to do on this call is to encourage anyone to be paranoid about anything. Paranoia and fear are enemies. And the president, he mouths off on Twitter about a lot of things, some of which, are very serious because he has powers as president to shape events, some of which are just, the daily musings of that person's mind, and he'll forget about it the next day, or it's a deliberate distraction because then we go chasing that down for a few days and we get anxious and outraged, and meanwhile he's on to something completely different, and so we need to be wary about that. President can't determine school curriculum. Congress, even the federal government as a whole, has very little to do with public school curriculum across the country. There are certain things that Congress has tried to encourage over the years through the limited assistance that we provide to school districts. But, I wouldn't put that on your top 100 list of things to be very, very worried about right now. In fact, I want us to, get back to what I think we will have a chance to do in a few months. And Oren made a very special point of emphasizing this: the need to teach critical thinking, the need to teach civics, basic American history and government. We've, most politicians for the last 10 years who talk about public education curriculum talk about STEM education, and that's really, really important for our economy. I think we need a renewed emphasis on those core competencies of citizenship. Whitney?
Yeah, I would love to add to that. So in addition to thinking about civics in the classroom, one thing that I would hope to see in the classroom is a different kind of focus on media literacy. Media literacy is absolutely critical, but I advocate for what I describe as ecological literacy, looking at the ways that we are all connected to each other and to the technologies that we use. And very often when media literacy is taught, a lot of the focus is on fact checking and critical thinking and source evaluation, and all of those things are absolutely critical. But as we've seen over the last few months in particular, even facts, even debunks, even things that otherwise are good from a traditional media literacy perspective can either be weaponized or they can be used to pollute the information ecosystem. And so thinking ecologically, zooming out and considering how do we fit in relation to other things, as if the media environment were the natural environment. Everything is connected, everything flows into everything else. How can we train young people and older people too, frankly, to understand the downstream consequences of what they do and how they receive the information that they receive? To speak to my earlier point, many people don't know how Google's algorithms work. They think that if they're searching for something, that's an objective return of the facts. And that's simply not how algorithms function. And so we have to have a better sense of what our network technologies do and are, and how we fit within them, so that we can make more ethical, more ecological choices about what we share and how we share. So that's what I would love to see in classrooms.
I'd love to, I'm back now. I'd love to just add quickly to that if possible. By the way, I'm pretty sure I was kicked off by QAnon, but I don't believe in conspiracies. So I want to double down that at a time where these conspiracies and they're trying to divide people, is that the importance of finding partners and then also attacking this issue through creativity. And what I mean by that is, we've talked about, the algorithms are taking folks down the wrong way. And, a lot of what we're seeing online, we try to compel these companies to do better, right? It's not unreasonable for all of us to say, don't, allow the celebration and glorification of violence or hatred. But it's hard. We need to keep sort of advocating that they change, but we also need to demonstrate and model how to do it. And this is where finding partners is key. And so I'll just give you one example. We are partnering with one organization where, based on people's searches, right? You go to Google and you search something. If you're looking for a conspiracy theory or an extremist or some sort of hate, you might get a result that is pushed up that gives you an alternative view to that hatred or conspiracy. Now, that may sound very big brothery, right? You may say, well, wait a minute. You're trying to sell us things and take advantage of the algorithm yourself. My point is this: we need to think about not just using algorithms to sell us products we don't need, not just using algorithms to, bring us closer to hate and conspiracies, but using those algorithms for good as well, right? It's just an option that's out there. And so, again, that's where we're trying to find creative ways, because at the end of the day, it's a battle of hearts and minds, and we need to make sure that the good content, right, the proactive content, the content that brings people together is as easy to find as that's trying to divide us.
You're here. All right, next question.
Our next question comes from John from Westfield. John, can you hear us?
Hey, Congressman, do you oppose the National Sex Offender Registry? If not, what did you do as the head lobbyist at Human Rights Watch to stop them from fighting against the National?
No, I do not oppose the National Sex Offender Registry. I strongly support Megan's Law, which is our version of that law here in New Jersey. And I think most of us on this call are sick and tired of the promotion of lies and disinformation in our politics, and that's what we're here to discuss. Let's go to the next question, DeAndre.
Our next question comes from Elena. Elena, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. And I was petrified today when I read the article in the Times about what Trump wants to do with our education system. And I had this picture of Hitler burning books. And I'm really, really concerned. Is Trump a member of this organization?
Well, I think my first answer to that is that this isn't an organization with members. There's not a membership card. We call it an online movement. People get sucked into this and other similar conspiracy theories online. They become believers in it. They help to spread it to others. Some of them may even act on it. What President Trump has done when asked to condemn it, he has declined to condemn it. He has kind of suggested that, well, if these people think that I'm our country's savior fighting the deep state, what's wrong with that? Which I think that the true believers hear as a signal that perhaps confirms their conspiracy theory, and that's what makes it dangerous to me, that he's sort of hinting that they may be onto something. Again, this is why I decided to try to move this resolution through the House of Representatives. I'm under no illusions that deeply committed QAnon supporters will read that the Congress, which they probably think is part of the deep state, has condemned them, and that they will say, oh gosh, maybe I'm wrong and I need to steer away from this stuff. But I really do think it's important to establish that however President Trump may be toying around with this, however other political candidates, including perhaps in our backyards, are toying around with this, as you just heard from the previous caller, that the overwhelming majority of Republicans and Democrats want nothing to do with it. The moment this becomes partisan, the moment it feels in the country like one political party is with QAnon and the other political party is against QAnon, that's the moment when we've lost, because members of the political party that is said to be with QAnon will naturally feel drawn to that way of thinking and to that movement. So I want to establish as a defensive measure that the overwhelming majority of Republicans and Democrats stand against this.
Thank you, Tom. Our next question comes from Stella. Stella, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you. I have a related question. So do you have a sense of how many politicians close to the movement or to the theory are running for election? And then I had another question. Where does the name come from? QAnon. what does it mean and where does it come from? Thank you.
I'll take the first part of that. There are, there are several congressional candidates who have quite openly embraced the QAnon theory, either by name or in substance. There's a woman running in Georgia, for example, who unfortunately the president has labeled a star, quote unquote, who continues to spout off stuff that is clearly straight out of QAnon, and she unfortunately will be elected. She has no Democratic opponent anymore in a district that's overwhelmingly Republican. So we'll have at least one, perhaps more. I think what concerns me a little bit more is that that QAnon has ceded a field, and that there are other political candidates who are trying to reap the fruit of that. They may not go full QAnon. They may even say that they disagree with QAnon, but they align their campaigns to play into the fears that QAnon is propagating. We're seeing a lot more references in political campaigns around the country, not just in our district, to issues of sex trafficking, sexual abuse. These are all very real problems in our society. They're legitimate issues to raise in a political campaign. But I don't think it's a coincidence that suddenly we're seeing an increasing number of references to this in political campaigns on one side. I think, they sense that there is this movement out there that is obsessed with this as a threat, and they're playing to it. And I think that is also a little bit dangerous. Whitney?
Yeah, and I can answer the second part of the question. So the message board where the theory was first surfaced, when you post to that message board, your name auto-populates as anonymous. And so the culture of that site was everyone was an anon, like they were referred individually as anons. And then the mass collective was known as anonymous. You might remember anonymous from the 2009, 2010, 2011, that was sort of that merged into other kinds of online movements, which is a complicated story all on its own. But anonymous is referencing 4chan, this particular board, and Q is in reference to allegedly the person who is Q and is providing all this information. They have Q level security clearance. And so within that culture, if you were a doctor, you would go by Dr. Anon, or you would identify yourself using Anon. So saying QAnon is basically just a way of indicating that that person is a part of or aware of that community norm, and that they have this particular kind of security clearance. So that's the origin of that term.
Okay. And by the way, Warren, I think you're on, but I can't see you. So if you want to chime in on anything, just come on in and there you are.
I think we can go to the next question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Perfect. Our next question comes from Vicky from Summit. Vicky, can you hear us?
Yes, hi. First, Tom, I just want to say I think you're doing an outstanding job, and it is very, very refreshing to have a representative who is so thoughtful and well-spoken. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
I don't even know how to phrase this, what the actual question is, but the same people who believe QAnon-type theories also typically are going to think that Russia trying to interfere in the election is a liberal conspiracy theory or a hoax or fake news. It's almost the flip side of the same coin, and I don't even know what the question is on that. But I can say from when things came out yesterday about the forced sterilization or hysterectomies being performed on immigrant women, it's so unfathomable to me that could be happening. That I thought that's got to be fake news or a hoax. So I don't even know what the question is, but it's affecting me as somebody who is horrified by QAnon.
Yeah, I would say very quickly, we have to be disciplined ourselves about how we react to information online. That was a horrifying allegation that ICE was engaged in forced sterilization. I don't know if it's true. So my reaction to it was, okay, there needs to be an investigation. The ICE Inspector General needs to look at this. We will investigate it in Congress. But just because, let's say, you are politically liberal, you may be inclined to believe that ICE under this administration would be doing something really bad, but we have to be disciplined and not go there without evidence. The same is true for the Russia. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Even if we have a pre-existing bias against, say, the Trump administration, we have to follow the evidence and demand the highest bar be cleared for evidence when the allegations are that extraordinary. And if it turns out to be true, then you take appropriate action. So we have to, all of us, whatever our political views, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, we have to try to set a good example in our own consumption of information.
Thank you, Tom. Our next live question comes from Betty. Betty from Bridgewater, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Somebody sort of asked this question, and you referenced the fact that there are several people who identify with QAnon who will probably enter Congress on the Republican side. Is there any movement among the Republican leadership to address this concern?
The Republican leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy, has said that there is no place for QAnon in the Republican Party. I appreciated that statement. Liz Cheney, another member of the leadership, has also made some fairly strong statements about it. Again, I hope, this is really up to Speaker Pelosi, I hope we get a vote on our resolution, and that if we do, a substantial number of Republicans will vote against it. If that happens, it will be good for the country. If they don't, I guess it will be illuminating in another way. But I'm optimistic that a substantial number would. That said, there wasn't much of an organized effort to find a different candidate in this race. I remember, I think it was 1990 when David Duke, the former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, ran for Senate in Louisiana and somehow got the Republican nomination. President Bush at the time repudiated him. The Republican Party dropped all support for his campaign, even though they knew that it would mean electing a Democrat to that very important Senate seat. So, things have changed a little bit. And I want them to change back. I'm not trying to play gotcha and paint the Republican Party as the QAnon party as a way of defeating them in an election. I'm trying to encourage as many people on the other side of the political aisle to join me in working against this. Even if we disagree on other things, we got to stand together against this because it's threatening the very fabric of our democracy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you both. Our next question comes from Mary Ann. Mary Ann, can you hear us?
Yes. Actually, I didn't really so much have a question as to, I wanted to see how many people actually do track with what Whitney had said about this positive versus negative free speech. I thought that was a very important point. And because literally every day, and this happens sometimes even with family, you'll be in a group text and then someone will say something horrific, frankly, of a political nature. And then inevitably, I will get 1 or 2 or 3 private text messages, which will say, oh, that was terrible. I can't believe a person said that. I would have said something online, but I was being afraid of being attacked myself. And I have a feeling that I'm not alone in this experience, but it's alarming, and it isn't so much a question, but it just was a comment to track to that positive versus negative speech and dealing with that.
Yeah. I sometimes encourage people to have historical perspective about our problems. There's a lot of anger in our political debate right now, a lot of viciousness. We're seeing it locally, we're seeing it nationally. But it's not like the first time in our country that we've been at each other's throats. Read the history of the founders and how Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and Aaron Burr went after each other. Ultimately, one of them Burr killed Hamilton. That's how bad it got. They didn't have text messaging chains, and they didn't have Facebook. If they did, there probably would have been a lot more duels and a lot more blood spilled. But the anger expressed in those debates was extreme. I think what we all agree on here is that we got to base these debates on facts, and that's the thread we're losing. That it's become easier and easier for people to go down a rabbit hole of just rejection of facts and reality and truth. That when that kind of stuff happens, even those of us who disagree on other things should be together. So yes, I feel your pain, but it's not a unique problem to this time.
Hi,
Warren?
Okay. If I could just add that I think that we need to think about how to resource to threats all the time, right? There's sort of different ways of doing that. And what the last person who spoke is talking about is something that I think we all can relate with. Is very personal, but there's also personal responsibility in helping figure out, like, all right, what do you do about this, right? We don't want to just all sit back and watch, this happen. And so here's just one idea, like reporting what you see. Now that could take a form of, something terrible on your Facebook or what have you. Flag that to Facebook, force them to make a decision about whether they're going to honor their terms of services or not. Mm-hmm. And if they're not, reach out to ADL, other organizations who are trying to track about how responsive are they being and how are they honoring their terms of services. I know in New Jersey and in other parts of the country, this has real world impact. So if you're going to see a hateful or QAnon related or God forbid worse, right, flyer in your community or an incident of vandalism, etc., report that. Report that to law enforcement, report that to ADL, report that to wherever, because data drives policy and we resource to the threat with the more that we know. And frankly, we need you all to report because there's too much out there for any one entity, government or not, to do it on their own. And by the way, it may make you feel like you're actually part of the solution because you are when you take that upon yourself.
Sure. Excellent point. Thank you, Warren.
Yeah, and to add to that too, I talk about this. This is the first lecture that I presented to my students in my 2020 election class. So much of these issues, mis and disinformation, they're often framed in terms of informational issues, and they are, of course, but they're also fundamentally mental health issues too. Because when you're constantly being surrounded by what one scholar describes as the tyranny of the loudest, not only does it sort of confuse you, anger you, make you not really feel like you have a good grounding of what's even happening, what that does for a lot of people is it just makes them want to throw their hands up and stop participating because it is so stressful and terrible. And that can very easily lead itself into undermining the democratic process. And so figuring out what to do about mis and disinformation at the platform level and at the policy level is critical because people are suffering as a result of what's happening here. And that suffering translates into all kinds of things offline, including the risk that people are just going to be so disgusted that essentially the way that I've described it before is that, voter depression becomes a form of voter suppression. When we just can't do it anymore, then goodbye democracy. So it's a really important point to raise, and I'm sorry that you and so many of us are having those experiences so frequently right now.
Thank you, everyone. Our next question comes from John from Mount Olive. John, can you hear us?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thank you, Congressman, for this session. It's very informative.
Thank you, John.
I have a small company. I've been in cybersecurity for 20 years. And one of the things that I think everyone should be cognizant of, and we've done it with our own family and our friends and our business clients, there's 3 tenets to security in cyber world: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So integrity becomes only available if you can authenticate who's talking and what are they saying. And my concern with your legislation is, I think we do have to get the platforms, and we have to get some method that the platforms have to be able to authenticate each users. Everything we're hearing today, and Whitney gave a very good history of how anonymous users became connected and how they remain connected. So regardless of whether you're just a social user, whether you're using social media for business or a government purpose or some other club purpose, when you say something on social media and you're anonymous, you have no accountability.
Yeah.
And I agree with the psychology that if everybody says it's raining out and you walk outside and it's sunshine, the physics of the world, you get very confused. And I think that's what we're leading into today. So my only suggestion for your legislation would be that platforms do have to have accountability, and they need authentication of users. And for everybody using anything on the internet, trust nothing. Verify on your own and then make your own decision. Thank you.
That's a really, really important question that you raised. And I have to say it's one I struggle with, and I'd love to get our panelists' opinions. And here's why I struggle. When I was at the State Department, one of my responsibilities was promoting freedom of speech on the internet around the world against, like, the government of China or the government of Saudi Arabia or Russia, that were cracking down on dissidents, on free speech online. And they all wanted authentication so that they could find the Nelson Mandela of their country, so that they could find the Martin Luther King of their country, who's posting criticism of the government online, and throw him in prison. On the other hand, clearly anonymity in our country, in our system, gives people greater license to just say absolutely awful things. So I don't know the answer. I'd love to hear Orrin or Whitney's advice on what we should do here. Whitney?
Hi, sure. So this point has come up a lot in my work. I started researching trolls on 4chan in 2008, so I've been doing this nonstop for 12 years. It's been great. But, you know, one of the things that would come up often in the early days and even now is this idea that, well, if we just make anonymity impossible, if we somehow found a way to just ensure that whatever someone posted was connected to them in a demonstrable, verifiable way, that many of the problems would go away. And I think that probably would reduce some amount of behavior that, you know, people engaging in it are just, you know, they're sort of blowing off steam. They know that they don't actually believe in the things that they're saying. So it would be too much of a pain, and there would be too much potential liability professionally or personally if their rude internet jokes were connected to them. But I think the higher level offenders, that becomes sort of a tricky idea because, you know, right now, algorithms in particular, not only do they allow, but they incentivize building brands around hateful content. And that's the whole, you know, impetus behind the No Profit for Hate campaign against Facebook right now, that people, it's not just that they're saying hateful things, they're making money off saying hateful things, and it is fully 100% named. So putting someone, you know, forcing people to speak under their own name only works as a deterrent if they're not somehow vested in those statements becoming public to begin with. And a lot of people, that's their brand. I mean, There's a book on conspiracy theories online, if anyone's interested, by Anna Merlin called Republic of Lies. And she refers to this as conspiracy entrepreneurship. You have people who have an entire professional life predicated on spreading QAnon conspiracy theories. They're doing it under their own names. And so they already are sort of meeting that criterion. And while I really appreciate and agree with the spirit of it, what do you do with bad actors who are like, I'm uncomfortable with having this attached to me. I'm comfortable with being a white supremacist. This is good for my brand. It's good for my business. All my friends agree with me. So it doesn't address the people who have no compunction about engaging in really problematic behavior, some of whom I won't name names, but some very high profile individuals in this country have no problem with it at all. So that's the part that I don't quite know how to deal with. And that I think pushes against anonymity doesn't get to the heart of that. But I'd be very curious, Oren, what you think here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is a very complicated topic. It certainly won't be solved, and certainly not in 5 minutes. But I'll try. No, I'm just kidding. I think Whitney mentioned the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. So I think that's instructive. This is a campaign that ADL, NAACP, Color for Change, and other partners have done. Where we for a month asked folks to not advertise on Facebook, and thousands of companies joined, including many that you know very well. We're now engaged in a sort of one day with celebrities, staying off of Instagram. These are efforts to raise awareness. They're not going to solve the problem, but the more that people feel that they have a stake in the public discussion, meaning these online platforms, I mean, that's step one. We are all here communicating via Zoom, right? This is a platform that has been engaged or been dealing with Zoom bombing, right? Extremists have manipulated this platform. So anytime there's a new platform, there are going to be those who are going to try to exploit it for bad reasons. I think that that's too late in the game. We have to hold these companies accountable. We have to ask them to do something about it. We need to realize that it's not unreasonable for us to even ask, right? But at the same time, it's got to be something where we're winning hearts and minds. We are finding other ways to communicate with people and turn them into allies. And that happens in schools. That happens when you're young. That happens in conversations with your family, right? That happens with feeling like you are part of it. And right now, I think one of the reasons there's so much of these issues being exploited on social media is that there's just more of them spending more time creating bad content. And I'd like to figure out a way of making it as sexy and cool to create good content.
Thank you so much, Oren. DeAndre, I'm actually gonna ask a question, if that's okay, because we did get a bunch of questions on this topic. When we've delved into politics on this call, we focused a bit more on the extreme right, because obviously this is kind of where QAnon comes from, and they have this crazy theory about the president and the deep state, which appeals to some of the more, extreme MAGA type supporters out there. But Oren, I also wanted to ask you what concerns you may have about the extreme left in our country. We did get some questions. What about Antifa, for example? What about what's happening in places like Portland and Seattle? How would you address that question?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Extremism, violence, physical confrontation has never been the sole domain of any one extremist group, right? All ideologies, left, right, can engage in this. And what we have seen in this country is, those who identify as Antifa have over years, this is not something that's new, found events in which Nazis, neo-Nazis have rallied and have gone out to oppose that. And their fundamental belief is that the way that you prevent fascism and Nazism from rising is you physically confront those people in the street, right? Listen, ADL, we're an anti-hate organization, right? So are sort of Antifa, they're anti-hate. What we don't do is engage in violence in order to make the point. And so there are those who are engaging in extreme tactics, and we need to reject that. We need to reject that because anytime anyone engages in violence, it normalizes it, right? Also, Antifa tactics, to the degree that those are happening periodically in Portland, etc., only serve to underscore the victimization mentality of those that they oppose, right? They say, see, we are being attacked. They are hitting us. They are. And so it's just practically not a good thing. That being said, in the last 10 years, there have been around 450 or some odd extremist-related murders in this country. 75% of those have been carried out by right-wing extremists. The majority of those, white supremacists. 25% of those by those who are motivated by, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So let's be honest about where that threat really is. And when you see people talking about needing to designate as terrorist organizations Antifa, which is a movement, and not those who are responsible for the majority of the killings, that becomes political in a way that we also need to be uncomfortable with. Speak out against Antifa, but recognize where the deadly threats have come from in this country.
Yeah, that is exactly where I am. So thank you so much. Look, we have an epidemic of disrespect for the law on both extremes in this country, on the far right and also on the far left. And the answer to that is rejecting that way of thinking and enforcing the law equally against everybody, whether you attack a police officer or a government building or a courthouse, or walk into, or on the far right, right-wing ranchers in Oregon declaring independent states and targeting law enforcement themselves. Whether you're on the left or the right, you got to be against that, and you have to be for holding everybody accountable under the law. At the same time, there are also conspiracy theories spread about this, and I think a really interesting one just cropped up in Oregon during these horrible forest fires that were spreading across that state, creating huge damage. Whole towns wiped out. A lot of people lost their lives. And in the middle of this, there was an online conspiracy theory that the fires were being set by Black Lives Matter or by Antifa. And as a result of that conspiracy theory, homeowners in places that were affected by the fires were staying home to defend their property against these fictitious rioters who were said to have been starting these fires instead of evacuating as law enforcement wanted them to do. And so the FBI and the state police had to frantically get online to say, this is not true. That's not happening, and you need to evacuate, right? And so people could have actually gotten hurt, maybe did get hurt because of the spread of that conspiracy theory. So again, let's denounce violence by everybody and acknowledge it happens on the left as well as on the right. Let's enforce the law equally, but let's be very disciplined about not going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. DeAndre?
Yes.
Can we take, I know we said 12:30. If anybody needs to get off, Warren, Whitney, otherwise, maybe take one more and close out.
Okay. Our next question comes from John from Garwood. John, can you hear us?
I can indeed. Warren, I was hoping maybe you can do a little bit of self-promotion, a commercial for your organization. What are some of the practical tools that you offer, and what are some practical things we can do to help you?
Thank you for that question. So tools in terms of combating extremism, getting involved. So one of the things that I just shared is, I mentioned earlier is report an incident. And hopefully it's being shared on the chat where you can report an incident to ADL regarding hate, discrimination. Again, that's one way to report. But I want to remind, if somebody is dealing with something very urgent, report that to law enforcement. ADL is not replacing law enforcement in terms of a place to report. We also have volunteer opportunities where those of you who want to understand, learn more about extremist threats, but also be able to become sort of part of our effort to track that, we can help you with that as well. I recommend folks contact your local ADL office. So for those of you in New Jersey and New York, we have an office there. And so here's the deal. ADL takes a holistic approach. You can invite ADL into your schools, where we can do a world of difference training, a whole bunch of different anti-bias training. That's where it starts. We can help get you in contact with law enforcement if you're dealing with an issue of discrimination or hate. We have relationships with the tech industry, where we're always trying to leverage our information to help them train their algorithms to identify hate. So the number one thing that you can do beyond using your voice in the bully pulpit that you all have to speak out against hate is be an ally for those of for others in your community. And if you need educational, resources, if you need to know how to talk about these issues, please contact your ADL office so we can support. And there, we can also explore other ways to get involved.
Wonderful, thank you, Whitney. I think that's a really great way to begin our closing of this wonderful event. And Whitney, I wanted to see if you have any closing thoughts as well.
I do, yes. First of all, for folks who are here, this is an extremely stressful time. We are all doing our best to make sense of a lot of things that are fully precedented and a lot of things that are unprecedented. And the best thing that we can do for ourselves is to think about how we are connected to everyone else. Think about the technologies you use. What do you not know about the technologies you use? What can you learn about those technologies that could give you a little bit more insight into not just where the information goes after it leaves your hands, but how does it arrive in your fingertips? And that can give you a little bit more insight of doing what I call sort of network mapping. What's above you? What's around you? What's below? What are the intended and potential unintended consequences of the things that you share? And if you see someone who's sharing stuff, even if they're posting and posting and posting to oppose QAnon, what are the potential consequences of that? What might happen that you're not planning to have happen? And just thinking about more than anything else, we are in this together on the left and on the right. No one can survive as long as everyone is struggling against the weight of so much polluted information. All flourishing is mutual. And so we have to find ways to ensure that we are able to flourish, others are able to flourish, so that down the road we can have respectful, vigorous debates, but actually end up on the other side still thinking of each other as human beings, and figuring out where you fit in relation to everything else is the place to start there. So if any of you have questions about things that you might be able to learn about your technologies and how you fit among those and other people, reach out to me. I'd be happy to share resources. And more than anything else, I just hope that you are taking good care of yourselves and the people around you, because we all are depending on each other right now. So thank you for your time so much.
Thank you so much, Whitney. Thank you, Warren, for joining us, and much more important, for all the work that you do every single day in different ways to keep us safe and to keep our democracy healthy. Look, I'm incredibly happy that we did this. I'm heartened by the number of people who signed up for this forum, just as I'm heartened in Washington when I can get Republicans and Democrats to come together on issues like this. When I see the good, decent career people in our Federal Bureau of Investigation, in our Department of Homeland Security, in our intelligence community, working together despite all the pressures they face to try to keep us safe and to push back against this kind of nonsense. I think the overwhelming majority of Americans are united with the overwhelming majority of people in government against things like QAnon, against extremism, political extremism on both sides. We have seen that a dedicated minority can do a lot of damage, but as long as we remember our power, as long as we remember that this democracy does not sustain itself, we have to do it as citizens, engaged citizens of this country. I think we are going to be okay. I'm going to continue to have forums like this. I'll obviously stay in touch with you all about our legislative work on these issues, and continue to get your input. Just thank you again for being part of the discussion, and hope that you'll join us for additional ones that we have in the future. Again, Whitney, thank you. Orrin, thanks. Thanks to my whole team who worked hard to pull this together. And have a great weekend out there. Stay safe, and please stay in touch with us.